I'm going to let Nancy, you kick it off.
We're going to say a little bit more about ourselves in a moment, but I just want to open up with a few comments. We have ingrained ideas about what safety means, but in the context of communities and policing today, we are struggling to define safety. And when I began thinking about the polarization within communities around policing a few years ago, I thought first about working from within police departments, so using methods of ethnography to gather stories of what makes officers and community members feel safe. I have worked as a consultant with local government my entire career, and I thought I knew something about good leadership within police departments. And then last year at this conference, I attended Gary's session, and I had a big aha moment. Afterwards, he and I began talking about how his sense-making approach might allow us to create a visual map of what is happening within community and policing, in community and police relations. And with this new approach, I could now imagine gathering stories from community members and police across entire regions and in a much shorter period of time and at less cost than other methods. So right away, I realized that gathering stories in this way was far more effective than traditional surveys, which is the tool of choice in most departments. And this session will help illuminate why that is. You will learn the value of building context for intractable issues inside a system and the importance of rich, informal ways of data collection that comes through stories. To put it succinctly, for me, this approach is all about helping people make connections and detect patterns. Only then is it possible to make small and eventually big changes to systems that are striving to adapt to new unknowns in the environment.
I don't have to spend too much time on the Zoom controls, so I'm just going to quickly bypass and just introduce yourselves. So I'll start out with me. And this is just a couple of links about me. As I show on LinkedIn, I call myself a complexity facilitator. I try to make sense of the real world to act in it. Since 2008, I've been running my own independent practice, focusing on complexity thinking and safety. Prior to that, I was an engineer working in utility operations, designing and constructing electric power lines, running line crews. And then later I went big consulting as a senior manager in strategy and transformation. In 2014, I co-developed an anthro-complexity-based approach to shaping culture with Cognitive Edge using their tool, which you will see today, called SenseMaker. The other picture is my website, which I really need to update. And of course, there is a Futocracy network. Okay, that's me.
And as I mentioned earlier, I'm an HR and org development consultant in the local government space. And I've been doing this for about 35 years. So I value high engagement methods in the design of HR systems. And I like conversations about the way things get done in the organization and how work is connected to bigger goals. I'm also the founder of a community for local government professionals called the Pioneering Change Community. And this project is an example of the type of work that we do in the community. That is, we hold informal conversations and work on collaborative projects to navigate complex issues in our field.
Well, this is an org change conference. This slide shows you the different paradigms we can look at. My definition of an app is approach, process, praxis. In that roll call approach, distributed ethnography is applying what we know from the social science of anthropology. Humans are natural storytellers, and that's how knowledge is transferred. Complex adaptive systems is understanding the human aspects of complex systems. Blended together, they form an approach that Dave Snowden calls anthro-complexity. Under process, there are two: vector theory of change and using SenseMaker software to design, collect, analyze, and report narrative data. Dave's term is naturalizing sense-making. Natural, because the vector theory of change is rooted in the physical and biological sciences that explain natural phenomena in the real world. Sense-making is, how do we make sense of the world so we can act in it? Praxis is putting theory into practice. learning as we go, monitoring operations in real time using an interactive dashboard. And if you want a real-time dashboard, there must be a continual flow of new narratives to dynamically refresh it. So we talk about journaling. Journaling is a habit storytellers will develop if they feel psychologically safe and engaged. This isn't I talk, you listen type of engagement. This is engaging the whole to co-evolve the present. In today's agenda, we'll cover just 3 things: distributed ethnography. We'll show you the SenseMaker online collector to enter your story. You get to do some hands-on work. And then later we'll come back and we'll show you the operational dashboard and display your entry as you've entered it. Now, you have the option of getting your hands-on, and we did offer that prior to this session. And if you've already entered a story, that's great. If not, we'll make some time that you can enter that. Then we'll take a look at the dashboard.
A little bit more information about the project. What you will see during this exercise is a tool we developed for our pilot project. We have assembled a team of police chiefs who are interested in this tool for their own communities. And after spending time with them individually and as a group, we developed a story collector to help us collect stories from inside the department and the community. We will take this data and build our leadership tools that capture the insights of the leadership team. Finally, we will explore ways to engage the community and department to support safety initiatives. For those of you who are interested to learn a bit more, you can check out the link that I posted. Just briefly, there are 4 essential phases that are outlined. We have phase 1, where we will collect the narratives using the web portal, SenseMaker, and we will also use some alternative methods with reliance on some students from the criminal justice programs at some local colleges who are going to help collect stories, just helping people with entering the stories into the portal. We also have in the second phase then what we call sense making, which is really just working with that leadership team to make sense out of the data, to glean patterns and insights and generate findings that describe what moves people towards feelings of safety. In phase 3, we're going to put that data in the hands of facilitators who are skilled at developing assessment tools, and they're going to focus on developing those tools for leaders so they can apply those tools in their departments. And then phase 4 will focus on engagement and really working on weaving together community and public perceptions of safety. And we will work on initiatives that help support those ideas around public safety, including perhaps these are things chiefs talk about. They talk about, just building diversity within the departments, addressing mental health issues, both of officers and of those in the community. So those are just some examples. Good leaders have a sense of what they know and what they don't know. And this process can help chiefs to repurpose what they know now to better understand new situations. Stories convey informal information, or what I sometimes refer to as just the tacit knowledge. And we know that this informal type information knowledge helps to build relationship better than, say, formal transfer of formal learned knowledge. Although both are important, we have never been able to quite figure out what to do with formal knowledge to actually build connections inside the community. Whereas that informal knowledge, which comes through the storytelling, is a much more effective way to work with relationship. So for example, let's say police officers recognize that there's new immigrant groups moving into the neighborhood. The new residents have a different cultural understanding of policing. And while they may have to adapt to the new situation, the officers must too. And the stories convey better than rules or laws what needs to take place when unsafe situations occur. So for example, if our interest is to increase feelings of safety, will we discover from our stories that people care more about the rules, such as enforcement activities, or relationships, such as community interaction? We may surmise, of course, that it's both, but by looking through the lens of stories about safety, which give us context, will we be able to discern when one, in what situation is one more important than the other? Another example, some police officers and some community members may share a similar world political view, which shapes the way they view safety and policing. In such cases, protests within that community will stir up deep feelings and emotion that relate to a person's sense of identity. Like a canary in the coal mine, polarization reveals our sense of vulnerability and can lead to feelings of being unsafe. Suddenly, we have a big problem within community. Let's take a look at the tool and come back later to talk about how this approach might impact a scenario like this, where there is a strong polarization.
This is the tool that Nancy spoke about. It's SenseMaker. It's online collector, and essentially it's on a browser on your desktop, or we can also have versions which are installed on your iPhone or your Android smart device. The first step is to offer a quick, easy way for storytellers to share their stories. This was developed by Dave Snowden way back starting in 2004 when Dave was working with DARPA, looking at situations with the US military. And this is what the soldiers used to collect their stories as they were being shot at. We're using the demo version, so don't worry about breaking this. If you don't have a story about safety and policing that resonates with you, no big deal. You can just put in a few words. What we really, really want you to do is just get a feel for it and then see how easy it is to use, or maybe you can give us feedback if it isn't and if it is confusing. So we want that feedback as well. As you saw in that SenseMaker process, the first step is design. And we like to design collectors that are user-friendly, intuitive, and attractive. And besides text entries, which we're just using today, we can also have the option to collect voice recordings as pictures. So Nancy, why don't we take them through the exercise?
Okay. Gary and I prepared this exercise while putting the workshop together. My experience putting a story in the first time was I just wanted to add more details than I needed to. So you can be very brief in talking about what happened to you in terms of what made you feel more safe or less safe in a particular situation. There's some brief instructions to give you a sense of how the tool works. Just brief, 2 to 3 minutes to describe your story. It'll probably take about 5 minutes to answer the questions. Only tell what's happening now or has occurred in the past. So we're not thinking hypothetically, we're just what's actually an incident that has actually occurred. Don't generalize, just get very specific. And then answer the opening question, which is what you'll see here. Just mention a time when you felt you were on the edge of safety and what happened that tipped your feelings one way or the other. Highlight if a key decision was made. Did something get decided that altered those feelings? You don't have to worry about facts too much. I mean, facts are fine, but you don't have to worry about getting specific. You could also mention any strong feelings you had during the incident. And just complete as many entries as you like.
Does anybody have any questions?
I have a hand up, Gary.
Yep, go ahead.
I created my collect exercise earlier today.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I don't know how it'll affect the whole exercise for now.
If you already have put one in, thanks for doing that. And if you want to put another story in, by all means do so, then we will have more data to look at it. One of the key things I want to show you is how your data appears in the dashboard. So more than one story would be awesome. Okay, just had another person join us as well. Thank you for coming. Good timing. We're just going to start the hands-on exercise.
All right.
So if you understand the exercise, spend the next 10 minutes or so entering a story. Okay, we'll stay here. And if there's any questions you've got, just raise your hands, talk to us. Yeah, this is really 100% interactive right now. For those that have entered a story and you're fine with that, Can you just put something in the chat that you're done? Because then I'll show you the next slide. Okay, next looker. The slide that I've changed to is asking you for some storyteller feedback. We've posed 4 questions. And if you have any thoughts or insights on that, please put them in the chat panel as well. Okay, so at this point, we want to take you through a simulation. So could I ask everybody to turn on your video and your microphone? What Nancy and I are going to take you through is what we would do as if you guys were the project sponsors, were the key decision makers. And we're going to be showing you that data for the first time. We want you to get that sense here. So can everybody that can turn on their video on their mics, and we'll make this really interactive. Great. Okay, Rick, thank you for that. And there's Reg. Okay, we want to make this really interactive so you get a real good feeling of what the capability is of creating maps and sharing stories. First of all, let me ask you the question, a storyteller feedback. Was there anything that tripped you up, confusing? Did you find that, hey, we missed some safety factors that aren't in one of those triads or dyads? And is it too long? So the design team would be listening on, observing the decision makers talk about the data. This is whole idea of Reg of coalition power, right? Everybody's in the same room together, maybe virtually as opposed to in person. When I show you the operation dashboard, it can be overwhelming. SenseMaker has the ability to convert those qualitative narratives into quantitative data points. The data can generate a variety of narrative maps from simple bar charts that you would see in a traditional surveying. We can also do what we call triangular heat maps. And we can also create 2D contour maps, which we'll spend some time. And these 2D contour maps, all that we're using are those dyads, very much like we see that overall, I would say the situation is, and we got a dyad, 2 extreme points. We just use those as X and Y axes, and the data visualization software generates these patterns. There's something that's somebody said to me, which is very, very true, is managers don't have a lot of time to listen to people. If you've got a group of 4, 40, 400, it's very difficult to listen to everyone. So thank God, our human brain is designed to recognize patterns. And one of the things that we found out is that these patterns can be generated by the stories that are shared. And what these narrative maps do is that these patterns show up as clusters or closely spaced contours. And that makes it very visual that you can kind of see. You can also understand too, as new narratives are entered, these maps will automatically change. This means that intervention improvements can be observed in real time. And what we'll do with some clients is that these narrative maps, they're just added on to an existing operational dashboard that organization is using. And those other dashboards are typically driven by big data. The SAPs, ERPs of the world, giving them data about the past. Well, what we can do now is add another gauge, which is about the current situation, looking as you're driving in a car and through the windshield in the front. And since narratives describe what people experience, essentially, this is a dynamic representation of a culture in real time. Nancy.
So in the context of this project, we can just say a few more things. David Snowden also talks about the importance of dense informal networks. Just imagine just many layered contexts of stories to build ecosystems that address unexpected problems. He says also that we need to reach across silos. Why is that? You think about this. Can we say that silos exist within communities and within police departments? Yes, 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 they do. The more context we build for experiences of safety within departments and the community, the more complex our system feels. And the question that we can ask is this why we resist stories and prefer traditional surveys, which provide neat and concise findings, but no context? Certainly within local government and within police departments, I find this to be true. So reaching across silos and thinking about working collaboratively, this story gathering can feel very, very messy, but it also is the core of this sort of informal, dense network of relationship. So I want to point to and highlight one of the significant applications of this approach to community and police relationships. And that is the ability to identify lead indicators of performance, such as attitudes, problem solving in the community, various kinds of engagement that we can look at with officers that we can say are predictive of high performance in that department. So often when I go in departments, I see they use lag indicators. I see a performance system that's about compliance, how many arrests, how many tickets, how many stops. This is very easy. It fits into their neat model, sort of linear model. And we want to, through this process, try to generate a larger context for what's happening in the field. Performance indicators represent a complicated challenge that departments love to address. So this is very important for status, for morale, and when it's well done, it's very important for professional development. So the fact that we can address performance in a new way using lead indicators, I see as one of the big values, outcomes of this approach. If we cannot get buy-in from police departments, we're going to go nowhere with this. That's true with my municipal managers that I work with as well. They don't want anything too messy. So we have to take this sort of approach and figure out a way to also bring some order to it. Polarization in the community, on the other hand, is a complex challenge and is only going to be addressed over a very long period of time. The sense maker approach will help the departments create small wins that can then evolve into bigger shifts in the community.
So we're going to go live now. I want you to consider yourself, you're part of that leadership group. You could be in the police side, you could be in the community side, and you're going to be seeing the data together for the first time. So this is very dynamic. If you have any questions, just blurt them out and ask, well, what can you do here? Because that's typically what would happen in this session. We've only got 30 stories. So I typically start off by saying, we've only got 30. So this is not sufficient to make any decisions yet. Don't converge, keep open. Hopefully this raises your curiosity that, yeah, we need to go and collect more stories. Well, where are these 30 stories from? Let's go back here. These stories, and we can just scroll quickly if that's the question. This is where the stories have coming from. Let me just knock off that filter. So you can see there's been 9 citizens. There's some leaders, officers, business owners. These sort of roles were predefined by the design team. Get a feedback, we're missing somebody, well, then we need to add them on. We're trying to see if we can do as best job as possible. And what I would do, I, as a facilitator, don't do any recommending. I let everybody just see it. We can do a lot of interesting things. We can actually click on the stories, because all the stories that you entered, you have a title. We also like to click on, look at the nature of the story. And you can see right now, there's an interesting picture. There's a lot of negative stories. There's actually 12 of them. But we've also got some highly positive ones as well, which is good to know. Now, where the patterns start to show up are in these triads. You can just see at this point, just where the dots are. And each dot is a story. In fact, if I hover over a dot, I can actually cluster that and I can filter that one story and you can see how that person responded to it. And if I can do one, if you ask the question like, well, what's all these stories about the engagement process? I can do this very quickly. I can just say, you mean these ones? Oh, there they are. And this is how the people responded. There were 7 entries at this point in time. Okay, this is the power of what you can do. So if you look at your typical bar charts that you got before, when you would get that, how often you would get a question if you presented this, oh, what's this negative stuff? What's in this bar chart? And I know in the past, I'd say, I don't know. But using SenseMaker, I can say, let's find out, because I can just click on the bar chart. And there is the 12 negative stories. But more than that, I can see, if you want to look at the stories, there they are. You can actually see the stories that people have entered that signify them as being negative. Okay? So you can see the power that we've got, and why I don't like to write reports anymore. I just do it interactively and let people ask questions where they're curious, and then we look at the data together. Okay. Now, for those who had entered stories, there's the 2 stories. And just to confirm that your story got entered, and by the way, I don't know who entered the stories. Everything's anonymous. But somebody entered a story called Just a Police Check, and we can look at the details and see how that particular storyteller shared their story and interpreted their story. Interpretation is really important, because this isn't Gary or Nancy saying, oh, I read this story and I know what that storyteller is saying. Crap, I don't know. The only person that really knows is the storyteller. And that's what we often call the authentic voice. The only person that can really signify or self-interpret is the storyteller. Right? And that's a main significant benefit of using SenseMaker software. So let me go back and let's look at the bigger cluster. Now, typically, when we do these things, we say we need about 200, 250 stories, which gives us a pretty good data set that you can start seeing really significant patterns starting to form. That also means, too, 250 individual stories to read, which is really, really tough to do. And that's why we want to focus on the patterns. We drill down, we look at the stories just to get the context. So it's a matter of decision makers getting up into the higher level to see the more holistic picture of what's really going on. And in some cases, we've had engagements where we've collected 40,000 stories. So and you just imagine, there's just no way that you can read 40,000 stories. We've used this for political places. We've gone there and we've collected 15,000 stories. And then you can just see the split between the far right and the far left and the folks in the middle. So as I scroll down through this, if you have any questions that you have, just open up your mic and just say, well, what's happening here? And I will click on the buttons to show you. Okay. A question that's often asked is, well, how did you pick these dyads? That's a very good question, because we got to start somewhere. And we would start by, number one, is looking at what has past research told us. These are real key critical factors that we should look at for safety in policing and community. Yeah. Another one could be a person on the design team that says, I have a hunch, I have a feeling, we should look at this. And we go, sure, we can.
For instance, when I see D4 getting extremely better what we already do versus move in an entirely new direction, I noticed in the responses from the chief's team that they were more inclined to say get better at what we already do. And I got curious about that. That's something that we'll have more conversations about. There is something in here, I think, that's helpful to create questions for your your team, whether it's your management team or your another type of group that's trying to problem solve. What is it that is actually happening behind some of these stories? And it takes you find something from the aggregate data that is interesting to you, and you begin to create questions from that.
And then we got a little bit more specific. Why don't you talk about this one, the magical one?
If I could magically change one thing overnight to make everyone feel more safe, more interaction between police and community, that seems to be something that pops up in a lot of the relationships between the data. It has to do with, again, interaction, relationship building. You're pointing the hand on the other. What is in there?
And here they are.
Okay.
Right. We're gathering now insights. We're gathering attitudes about what people are thinking as well. And that's a point, Nancy, that you made, is that this is all about attitudes. That's what stories got. And so it's looking forward and giving the leaders some thinking about what do we need to look at going forward to either accelerate or else dampen.
Yeah.
Anybody got any questions at all? Reg, you okay with that? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I've got a question.
Yeah.
As you know, I'm an old-fashioned OD person, and so I've got my famous cup of tea, and I sit there listening and asking questions. And it's my naivety and ignorance of the system. What seems to be missing for me, and I hope it isn't in the overall process, is there's lots of issues that come out of these questions. One of the things for me is what has changed, what were they good at before and they're not good at now, and what weren't they good at before but they're better at now, that type of thing, because we're then putting it into a different sort of context, and I just wonder how that comes into the conversations.
Yeah, okay. What we can do, if we can get to the point where people feel safe that they can enter stories willingly over time, because right now you're just looking at a snapshot for today, but we have the ability to click on here and we can actually say, well, let's look at what the stories were told 6 months ago and look at the maps then. Now let's go today and do a comparison between 6 months ago and now. And you can actually start seeing, like, wow, the dynamic shifting of the maps. And this is where we get into the narrative maps. They really show up, but you can actually even see them in these triangles where the dots start to shift.
Yeah, this relies though on a long-term relationship over time. Many organizations, my guess is, would want this over a shorter time to use this to help them make sense of things. Yeah, so that's why I asked this, because the history is in the organization and it's how we get it out, because the stories of today tend not to do that in my experience.
Yeah.
As you may know, I spent 31 years working with police in London, and with major changes, and certainly based on that experience, these are the things that were critical in the outcome of the ways forward, if you like.
Yeah, it'd be interesting when you told your story of London police, what were the stories the bobbies were sharing back then compared to what the cops are sharing today, and just see how these maps would have shifted.
Certainly, if you had this for 31 years, you'd see it shifted significantly, but the underlying issues are the same.
Yeah, and that's where we'll get into later, not today, but we get into this concept of the vector theory of change. And we start looking at what are those system constraints are causing people to behave this way. And that's where it gets really interesting in terms of what sort of constraints do we do more of, do less of, tighten, loosen, and then we experiment and just see how the stories shift over time.
There was an example from this past week. I was having a conversation with a lieutenant from the Philadelphia Police Department, and he said specifically, he had lost a promotion early on because he had there was an indiscretion when he was a police officer, and he said it created such a huge disappointment in my life when I lost that promotion. I started thinking about the bad cycles of leadership that came. In other words, I was trained from earlier generations that were doing things differently. This reminds me of your question, Reg. So some, older officers that came through the departments when there was a different form of leadership are having to really shift. And there needs to be, it was in this case, this lieutenant who really made major changes. He had to really go out, be outside the department and learn what is it that needs to be happening here that's not happening in the department now, and start thinking about what needs to be done differently in order to improve policing. So he's now, on a leadership track. But what we've done, I think if you could rephrase that, one more time, Reg, you said, what is it we do now that's better than the way we used to do it? Was that the way you said it?
No, I wouldn't say anything's good or bad, better or worse.
Okay.
For me, it's trying to find out, when it comes back to Gary's very first question about look at it and ask questions what may or may not be missing. Because one of the big mistakes that I noticed in my experience of working eventually with Margaret Thatcher, the Prime Minister, on these very subjects in the UK at that time, was the focus was very one-sided at that time. It was very much about what are the police not doing properly, whereas it was also necessary to get out in the community and spend a lot of time there and understand that as well, because there's a lot of relationship between the two, as I'm sure you'll find in your process. And so that's where my questions come from. When I looked at the grades that you had for the people filling in the document, the information, the stories, to what extent are they broken down enough in terms of the hierarchy of the organization? Because one of the things that's changed significantly in policing is the relationship between the different levels.
Yes.
And so it's that type of thing that, being hypercritical, which you asked us to comment on, those are the things that are missing from my experience, but it may be that because I was approaching it from a different direction.
Really valid questions, because when we're in the design phase, we're trying to balance between too much information and trying to protect anonymity. These are what we call multiple choice profile questions. And one that I disabled for this exercise is showing where the incident, the experience took place. In this case, in Pennsylvania for Nancy, we've broken up Pennsylvania and split into 4 just areas, because the police chiefs are wondering, well, is it happening, that story happened in my turf or somebody else's turf? And then you can see, we can narrow it down to like, which precinct do you want to talk about? But then some people push back saying, well, I am not going to answer that. And we always give the prefer not to say option for people, because they can quickly be identified. And of course, the last thing we want to do is have decision makers think, who told that story? Who said that? Because you're looking for somebody to blame, right? And once we hear that, we just quickly elevate them back up to look at the patterns and stay there. Because again, you want to increase the story sharing as opposed to decrease it. What I'm showing you now is something called Workbench. That first set is what we call the dashboard, and it's meant to be at a glance. It's meant to be for decision makers, just get a pulse on what's happening and look at, oh, what news stories have been entered? Click, oh, this makes me curious, that sort of stuff. What I'm showing you now is where you've got those data analysts. I would say, this is what we would give the purpose alignment team. This is a tool that they would have, because they can really roll up their sleeves and get into the nitty-gritties of deep diving as far as they want. This is a very simple set, and this is just using our language, those really cool tools that have come about. I don't know those languages. I'm more of a user, but it's the same data. And in this case, those are the same triads that you saw. But we can do some interesting things, all depending on what people want to look at and what to see. We can actually show them with contour maps in the triad. We can give percentages if people feel like, I like to look at, okay, oh, 21%, 31%, that makes more sense to me. Or if people have a very visual graphic mind, you can see where there's a big cluster heading towards response. We can show them that if they want. We can show them all the dyads, and this is your typically stuff that a survey monkey would give you. Gives you the mean, the medium, all those sort of things. We can color them, we can do all sort of stuff if you want to show that. And if you do need to produce a report, we have the ability that you can just click on save the graph. Then you can just blow that into some report that you want to do as a snapshot. The one that we're finding really interesting is this one called the dyad cross. All that we ask the software to do is take those dyads and plot them against each other. So D1 versus D2, then it's D1 versus D3. And as you can see, because we've got 6 dyads, we end up generating a lot of maps. Now, some of them make a lot of sense. Some of them are just honestly pure garbage. So again, we need for these data analysts to look at that and say, what is really interesting that we should focus on? This is where the interesting patterns show up. And the one that we want to spend our time on is D4 and D5. This one here. Okay, so Nancy, you just want to maybe just talk. How would you describe this? Like, again, we're facilitators, so we just describe it, and then we'll ask you guys, what do you think of it? Go ahead.
Yeah. So in here, it seems to on the Deforest, we're asking, for this situation, we can increase feelings of safety if we. Now this is the x-axis, so we are looking at getting extremely better at what we already do or move in an entirely new direction. As you can see, there's a cluster down towards getting extremely better at what we do. And when we put that in relationship to D5, which says this story reinforces the need for people to learn safety through, the option is real life experiences or exhaustive communication about safety principles and policies. And we see this concentration down at the lower end of that y-axis. So it creates this heat. Now, those are 2 separate questions about stories. But again, when we look at that, is there anything in here, for instance, that validates our current view of what's going on in the police department? We might ask that. Is there something here that surprises you, that doesn't sort of fit with your idea? You're talking to people who are out in the field. If this is a team of chiefs of police, what would they make of this? I can't possibly read into it, but I can ask questions about what that possibly might mean. What is the difference between a consultant and a facilitator? I can use my imagination, what I think that means, but what I would be doing as a facilitator really is asking the chiefs what that looks like to them. Does anything come up when they look at that cluster?
Any thoughts? Any comments? What is this graph telling you?
Yeah, you're the team, so I'm a facilitator. You're allowed to use your imagination.
This is what your folks are telling you. What are they telling you?
Well, I come back to the same thing I said just now. That bottom right-hand corner is quite classic to get better at what we do.
Mm-hmm.
The thing that's missing from that is which aspects of what they do and which areas of what they do.
Yeah.
So it's good. It's a good catalyst for a discussion. That's for sure.
Yeah, great.
Yeah.
That's a great way to put it, Red.
Yeah, and then we may say, somebody say, well, what's this dot mean? And whatever, you can see that word violent resistance. That's that short tag somebody puts in. And I can, so I can go over each dot and a different thing comes up. If I were to look in this area, and I'll shift my hat, if we want to get better, you know what that's telling me is that we don't want to stick our people in classrooms, taking certifications, a lot of training. We got to get in the field and maybe connecting up with senior vets, whatever, and get those real life experiences. Right?
Gary, you talked about, yesterday we talked about outliers, and the right hand bottom corner, there's a significant number there that would really cause me to do a lot more in that area as well.
Yeah. Well, the one that really gets me is this one way up here all by itself. Party going awry. What the hell is this all about? What we can do, we can just go, what is this all about? I don't know. Let's have a look at that. And you can read the story. All right.
Oh, yeah. I'm familiar with this story. So it was the way officers handled a particular situation of partying youth. There was what I felt a need to get more clear about safety parameters when youth congregate and have fires and fireworks and who knows what else. And so that was my reaction, that there needed to be more sort of regulation and to go in a new direction, because my experience of that police interaction was that they were just probably teens with like these teens one time, and they didn't want to disrupt their party. Instead of thinking about me, who was terrified, wanted to get out of there. So that was my story.
So that's how we can look at outliers, Reg. And with the context there, then decision makers may say, we need to put that on the parking lot sheet and look at that, or else like, we can dismiss it. That's their decision that they make on that one there. I would probably say, wait a minute, you've only got 31 stories. That ain't enough. You really need more data, because then who knows that the maps may change because of that. Right? So this is why we always encouraging people to keep on adding stories. And we start moving into what we call a journaling phase. And this is what Dave Snowden did way back in 2004, Afghanistan, when John Poindexter wanted to find out how are the troops doing in the field, because he kept on getting the answer back from the generals and crew. Oh, they're just doing fine. They're happy. And Poindexter says, am I getting a boatload of what? So Dave says, well, all these soldiers, they're packing these smart devices. Why don't we give them the opportunity to tell us what's happening in the field today? And the easy sell to the patrols were, if you were to journal as the situation is occurring, then you don't have to do weekly patrol reports, which nobody likes to do anyways. Because by Friday, when you try to summarize the week, you've probably forgotten most of the stuff that happened on Monday and Tuesday anyways, and you're just filling in forms, which they found out nobody was reading anyways. So they said, oh, fine. So they had incidents where there were patrols that were pinned behind gunfire, sitting there. So the guy would pull out his app and just start telling the story about being caught under fire. Well, how current can that be? Pretty darn current. And plus they can express their emotions about that as well. So Poindexter got a pretty good feeling what the morale of the troops were in 24/7, 365 real time. And of course, over time, over a decade and a half, there's been a lot more improvements, and we're still working on things that we can do.
I love that, Gary. And I would just add to that I'm very intrigued about this project. And I know what I felt when I was entering the story, I rethought the situation. And I think having the community engage in this storytelling will also help them rethink the situation of where they might have taken bolder actions or different actions or could get more involved, which is what we want in many cases.
So this is what Nancy just walked you through. We just ask questions. But the last two questions are the most interesting. When I heard Ross's talk about direction, alignment, and commitment, we can use these maps to set direction. think about us as this tiny ship of order into this vast sea of chaos. Where is the direction? Where should we go? How do we want to shift those clusters, and where do we want to be? We can ask that not in terms of goals and measures and targets, but talk about where do you want to see fewer unfavorable stories, and where do you want to see more desirable stories over time? And this goes back to your comment, Reg, about seeing these things shift over time. We can do that.
I was just wondering, with AI now and the different algorithms, we can do quite deep analysis, discursive analysis in trying to sort out, if you like, the symptoms from the underlying causes. How far can you go with this software in that direction? Because the outliers that we mentioned earlier, the two in the top right-hand corner, they could be symptoms of something that's not being shown up somewhere else.
Yeah, this is really what we talk about, the vector theory of change. And Nancy, I'll use this to answer Reg's question, okay? All that we've done is really talked a bit about the first two steps. We show you how you can map the current landscape of culture and attitudes, and how you can set headings with more stories like these, fewer like that. And when I say vector, I talked about a direction which has a heading and a speed. We set the heading. Now we want to set the speed, and we know that we want to look at using the maps, where are the enabling system constraints and the lowest energy cost to scale. What do I mean by that? I can go back to this example. If we wanted them to say, we want you to go over here, how do we get them to go from here to there? We're looking at the contours, and it's just like you would want to avoid hills and valleys. So find ways to make it really easy for them to get there. And this is where we start asking the question about what sort of interventions can we do, and what small changes that are easily possible. And we do them by nudging the system. And these don't come from us as facilitators. They will come from the design leaders and the decision makers. You know, I think we got a real problem with issues about how we handle guns. I'm making this up, I don't know. We need to test that. So let's have a case where in this area, and again, we make it small, so we put the boundaries on around there, the constraints. Only in this precinct, they don't wear guns for the next 2 months. Now, we want to make these safe to fail, so maybe that's not too safe physically, but we want to find something that they can do and just gather their experiences. What was it like? What was it like going back to the 1800s, being a bobby, not carrying a gun? As opposed to then we may want to say, well, at the same time, let's have another precinct and let's do an experiment where they get to carry M16s with them.
I'm going to ask Luca if he wants to just suggest this. He has a comment that I think is juxtaposing community with police.
Okay, yeah, go ahead, Luca.
Yeah, I was just wondering whether in those very interesting graphs, if you could have colors to highlight that maybe some of the clusters are more related to one group or the other.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. If you recall, we had the slide where we showed who are the storytellers, police leaders, citizens, business owners.
Yeah.
We can click on the citizens, and we can see all the stories just coming from citizens. We can also do that for students as well. And how safe do students feel from the police and then from their own community? And the community, they could be talking about the local university. Yeah, so we can do that. So we can take different slices and dices of the data, and then we can do some comparisons. Very, very true. And then that may be one of those nudges we do. Let's try something that just affects students and see what happens. Okay.
Interesting.
Okay. And what we do, again, to make things easy, and this goes back to the idea of Reg, you and Ross were talking about the whole idea of power and control and constraints. I often talk when I do safety stuff, those human imposed constraints of regulations, policy, standards, systems, structures, best practices is a constraint as well. Some of them are enabling, some of them are governing, some of them are disabling, unintended consequences. Oops, we didn't mean that because we didn't know. So that's what we want to experiment and change some of those constraints, because really, as change interventionists, that's all we can really change are those work conditions. We can't force people to change their behavior, but we can certainly change those work conditions, and then people will respond and make choices based on those work conditions. What are they? I don't really know, so let's go find out together.
Yeah.
I really, really support what you've said there. I've been monitoring over the last 5 years the incidences of very violent police action or death as a result of police, and significantly, the first response tends to be, I did it according to protocol.
Yeah.
And whilst that's their defense mechanism, they will not change.
Yeah.
So I really support what you're saying there.
Yeah. We have a real live example that's still going on right now in Canada, in Ottawa. We have this thing called the Truckers' Freedom Convoy, which started off with unvaccinated truckers who are not supported by the Truckers Alliance, who want everybody vaccinated, to head over to Ottawa. And as they're heading over to Ottawa, they're picking up all these very interesting far-right people. And then you find out that the guy that's organizing this whole thing on the GoFundMe is actually posted things on social media about taking down the government, removing Trudeau, all this sort of stuff. So now they're in Ottawa. They've been there for Friday, and they're at an impasse. So I'm watching very carefully how the police are responding, because of course they're getting a lot from citizens. They're blocking us. We can't do our business. We're not letting them into our restaurants because they're unvaccinated. So the protesters are going to the homeless shelters and demanding food. You're seeing all that interesting behavior. And the police are just sitting back and getting really criticized for this, Reg. What they're thinking right now is, this is a protest. There has been really no violence so far. Nobody's really breaking any really bad rules other than, they're standing on statues and defacing things, small stuff like that. And slowly the crowd is dissipating. And the best part, though, was one of the chiefs says, we need to negotiate with the so-called leaders on their exit strategy, because I think they started a war and they don't know how to end it. So very fascinating to watch. And I think that's a learning that we're going to have.
I think this is crucial what you said. If you think back to the old days of the coal mine disputes and all those sorts of things and the Northern Ireland troubles, when I was working with Thatcher on the policing side, people were demanding that police go in and do X, Y, and Z. And we said, no, let them fight each other, provided no one's getting hurt. Then if we send in police, you create a problem, because then they have a target. And so I think what they're doing in Canada is excellent. They've now stopped the GoFund page, which is even better, because I think it got to about $6 or $8 million, which is ridiculous. Right. And so this do nothing actually is one of the best policies, provided you do it intelligently. And so I think they need to be congratulated on that. And the exit strategy is exactly what happened in Northern Ireland.
Yeah, and the do nothing is not being in paralysis. It's a deliberate do nothing.
it's a do nothing with lots of activity underneath.
Yeah, let's negotiate how we can get the trucks out of there without causing too much problem. You're so right. Right. Okay. Nancy, did you want to talk about any more in this slide?
No, I think that we're coming to the close of the time, and I'm open to any comments. I just wanted to add, in terms of the project context, again, that the challenges right now are just sitting with this discomfort of having a lot of stories, particularly with the police chiefs. You know, there's this idea that there's just a lot of situations and stories where there's no clear answer. So sitting with that discomfort is a challenge. Also, just building awareness of the value that can be brought about by this story gathering is something that is taking a huge amount of energy, and you can imagine it takes some conversation to really understand what it's about. And third is the polarization going on. We talked in the last week, I had in a LinkedIn post, which I normally get lots and lots of responses on a LinkedIn post. And it was, as you know, it was just a chill effect. Police and community relations. I don't know if I should like that or not like that. So, you know, it just is there's a lot of, there's a lot of aspects to this. I feel like it's a pretty courageous project approach, but it's necessary. And so I would just say that.
Okay, so that concludes it. One last slide was just to say that I and Nancy will pop into the Wonder Room if anybody wants to carry on their conversation for another 15, 20 minutes. Ross suggested I create an area called sense making. I don't know how well this has been used, Reg, if the people have been going in there or not.
It's not being used in the way that we hoped it would. I've actually used it with students more than anything. With lockdown, they don't get socialization, so I run student socialization sessions there, and they quite like it.
Yeah. Just as a story, I did a 50th year reunion of my engineering class of 71 in September, and I introduced the Wonder Room there, and we had about 50 classmates that were in the Wonder Room. Yeah. Running around. We had mechanicals talking to electricals, talking geologicals. It was quite fun using this.
And if you were there at Christmas, you could even have them having a snowball fight.
Yeah, right. Virtual snowballs, that would be fun.
Yeah. I mean, if I could just make one final comment. When you asked me about the difference of 30 odd years ago, I looked at it from the period of 1966 to 1997. And when I say the underlying things are pretty much the same, it's more violent today because society has generally become more violent. But the thing I think is a common denominator with what's happening in most of the world is this loss of consent by the public for the police. And when people are looking at these ways of improving what we do, I think that should be the underlying thing, is it's all aimed to get back, because without consent, you have no relationship between police and public. And for me, that's the key. They've lost it in the UK, totally lost it now. And so, yeah, that's my sixpence.
That's good.
Since you're online, Reg, we're just wondering, that story you told about the London police, really resonated with me. Is it okay if we share that with Nancy's police chiefs?
Yeah.
Thank you, because I think it's the contrast between very disciplined internally, then going out and say, okay, you're on your own, you got to self-manage. I mean, I think we're talking a bit about that. One of those dyads is, do you bend the rules to get things done, or do you bend the stuff to stay within the rules? What do you do? And I think we're overwhelmingly saying, well, we have to bend the rules, right? Which could make some people really upset, particularly the compliance people. But in some organizations that we've chatted to that run into that dilemma, we've asked, so what is your rule that you have that says you can break the rule? and made people stop and think, oh, yeah, because that's what happens anyways. So,
Yeah. I mean, I could bore you for hours. We looked at the relationship between corruption and less police corruption, and at what level society would sustain it and accept it. And when it got beyond that and they wanted it stopped, then the things that the police were controlling, which at that time was prostitution, drugs, pornography, and stuff like that, escalated as soon as the police corruption went.
mhm.
There's always, in all societies, this
Yeah.
balance between corruption and whether it's in business, politics, or whatever. And of course, that was another dimension we had to look at, because most of the senior officers at that time, particularly in the early 70s, were deep in corruption. So we had to deal with that before we could make any changes.
Wow. Right. The time has really flown by. So on behalf of Nancy, thank you for joining us, and hopefully it's been useful for you and learned something. And Nancy and I hope to carry on, and then maybe in year 3 of our global conference, we'll come back and share some results with you.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it. For an old-fashioned OD guy, I never stopped learning, and thank you for the opportunity.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being on.
Being here, everyone.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you. Very interesting.
Great. And we definitely will post this, like everybody else has, on YouTube as well.